Good afternoon. It's me again. It's Mike Head from Ethical Screening, and this afternoon I'm talking to Felix Odey from Schroders. You can introduce yourself, and then I'll explain what we're talking about and why.
Perfect, sounds good. Hello everyone, my name's Felix Odey. I'm a portfolio manager on the global thematics team here at Schroders, specifically a named fund manager on the Global Sustainable Food and Water Fund, the Global Alternative Energy Fund, and the Global Energy Fund more broadly. And today we're here to talk to you about the food and water system.
The main purpose I encountered, that sounds terrible. I first met Felix at an event that Schroders ran down in Bristol, which was around regenerative farming. And it's one of those topics that the more you learn, the more excited you get about it and the more interesting it becomes. And so I just thought the purpose here is we're going to have it's two different sections. The first one is about the topic, and the second one is in relation to the sort of financial solution, if you like, the way in which it is possible to monetize these areas, and certainly there is a pressing need.
I think the starting point when we're talking about food and water is very hard to overestimate how important it is for the world and for the environment. And whenever we're talking about the challenges in the food and water system, we really split it into two parts. And the first, I think, is quite well understood, which is that the world population is still growing. On our estimates and aligned with the UN, we'll need about 50% more food by 2085, which is already a huge undertaking. Within that, we also know that as people get richer, or GDP per capita basis, we also see the consumption of protein go up. But actually, the really crucial point, which I think is underestimated and really ties into how you assess financial risk for the world and for the companies in the system, relate to the sustainability outputs. Whether it's water, where agriculture accounts for about 70% of all usage, whether it's habitable land, which is about 45% of all habitable land being used for agriculture, whether it's physical pollution, be that in the ocean, be that in landfills, where food and beverage and the packaging around it accounts for around 65%, or biodiversity, where agriculture, again, is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. Agriculture is really at the center of all these things. In addition to that, you also have agriculture, if you include things like transportation of food, accounting for estimates vary between 25 and 34% of greenhouse gas emissions. So I suppose all to say there's a lot to talk about here, and getting it right. And you mentioned regenerative farming. I think that is one bullet in the arsenal that the world has to try and balance this predicament and dilemma that we're in, which is that we need to produce a lot more food whilst lowering the resource intensity of the system. So maybe that is a frame. Happy to jump a little bit more into the role regenerative farming plays, or how I see this playing out. I'll let you steer, Mike.
I think one of the most interesting and exciting things about the event down in Bristol at Belmont was the realization that there's the expectation that by going down the regenerative route, it is less profitable, less margin, etc., and the reality being quite the reverse. And it is an ironic world when people are watching Clarkson because he's talking about farming in a way that is not quite Top Gear Clarkson. And I think that's something that would be worth picking up and sharing now.
Completely. And I think, again, it's really important to keep in mind, the UK is a huge topic in its own right, and UK farming is a huge topic. And as someone that's sort of been applying through some of the sustainable farming incentive application process, as someone that's kind of gone through that this year, what we've really seen is the UK government trying to move away from a system that essentially just incentivized farmers to maximize production each year without thinking about what the long-term implications were for the total production on, let's say, a 20, 10, 50-year view. We've seen incentives begin to move away from that and recognize that actually, not all land should be being used to try and intensively produce crops or lamb or cattle or pigs, and actually should be used as biodiversity corridors, which in the longer term will boost the productivity of the remaining land. So completely to your point, when we go to somewhere like Vermont or when we see Clarkson, talking about the difficulties of farming, the risks that farmers take, and the massive cost inflation that we've seen in agricultural inputs, all of that points to a very clear fact, which is that one, the amount that we pay for food today doesn't reimburse farmers sufficiently. And two, we have this hangover today from a long banquet of subsidies that really just went into short-term maximization of production without thinking about the long-term impacts on the land, on soil, and on the wider environment. So I think regenerative farming is a really interesting solution to this. Part of this as well, though, is that we are in a global system, and at the moment, if you look at the kind of agricultural superpowers of this world, they are much lower down on the cost curve than UK farmers. So part of what we see with the volatility of the profitability of farmers is the same as you'd see in any other commodity. It's if you're at the top of the cost curve, you're much more exposed to that volatility in price, and you're more likely to have a larger number of years where you're less profitable. I think in some ways it actually gives the UK a real opportunity, because it does make us have to ask some very difficult questions, which is, have we transformed too much of the UK into farmland, and actually do we need to see some of that reverse? And I think farmers are also recognizing that might be the case. So it's a really interesting kind of pivotal time, but I think there is probably two stories here, which is the UK and the world more broadly. Because whilst I think regenerative farming completely can improve the productivity and the profitability of land for farmers in the UK, we do know that we still need intensive production in other parts of the world, just given the demographic challenge that we're facing as well.
I think the sort of the biodiversity soil health thing is one I find particularly interesting, because the argument around the environment is, well, we're a tiny percentage of global output, etc., and however much is going on, you get that parroted, oh well, America and India and China. But the reality is we have the ability to do something about our own. We can't do anything about that significantly and make a dent. We can in terms of the health of this country, and I think that's gaining an awful lot more awareness. And of course there are the sort of poster children which started with NEP, etc., and probably the ones who went before are a bit resentful of that, but that's the reality. And so it's very much something that's becoming much more widely known and represented.
Completely. And as you say, I think there's been early movers in this, but we've seen how quickly soil degradation can be reversed and things like that. We've seen other technologies coming in. One of the stats I always found very interesting was when you looked at the kind of import dependency for food in the UK, it's actually very varied between, when you look at things like fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, where, traditionally we've been hugely import dependent. Whereas if you look at some of the kind of larger scale crops that we do farm here, we're less so, or we're about in balance. So I think there's huge opportunities to, one, improve the productivity of the land that should be being used to produce these large scale crops, but also for technologies that are coming along like vertical farming in the UK, which is helping to address the kind of import dependency in the traditional areas like fruit and veg. So yeah, it is changing very, very rapidly, and I think the incentives are helping, but I also think there's almost a farmer fatigue. I think when you talk to farmers and when you also see the kind of feedback in things like Clarkson's Farm, there's a fatigue of farmers just trying to use more and more chemical additives to essentially eke out one more year of decent yield, and that gets accelerated when we have things like the Ukraine crisis, which has increased the cost of fertilizers around the world, including the UK as well.
And that's sort of hurtling towards the problem that's inevitable, because the number of crop cycles we have left in this country without action is terrifying. It's your life. It's not quite my lifetime, but it's definitely yours.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is something that is true in the UK and is also true in the world, and it is not something that's being addressed, and it's certainly not being reflected in valuations for the companies that are linked to it. And when you look at what percentage of the MSCI ACWI, let's say, it is food and beverage companies, it's sort of sub 3% at this point. So I think it's very easy for mega themes like AI to kind of take all the air out the room, but ultimately, the bare necessities of life are food and energy, and I think we are seeing probably an underestimation of the difficulties that those systems are facing today. And yeah, the UK is a really interesting case study as part of that. But it's going to be a global phenomenon as well. And when we look at the feedback loops that exist as well, one thing that we haven't spoken about is, when we look at the trajectories, all the data that we have looking at the trajectories towards the degree scenarios, it looks very, very unlikely that we hit 1.5 degrees. It looks increasingly unlikely that we hit 2 degrees. And when you move above that threshold, all the science is pointing to the fact that you get negative feedback loops emerging. I think the estimates for corn and wheat are that yields drop by about 10% respectively. So again, I think it's the scary image not only of desertification and how many soil cycles you have left, but all of the conveyor belt, or the sort of the running machine that we're on is just getting faster and faster to stay still, let alone increase the overall production by that 50% that we spoke about at the beginning.
Yes, because it's that thing, isn't it, that the soil's deteriorating, the bees are disappearing, and it's very exciting to see what the AI is going to do. But the good thing is they don't need food, but sadly we do.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think when you look at things like bees, and when you look at how the specialization that we've seen really since the 1960s and the kind of industrialization of food has come with huge efficiency gains and huge benefits, and it's driven down the cost of food massively. I've been reading a book at the moment called The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. And one of his points is that when you look at the percentage of people's incomes that were being spent on food, kind of in the 60s, it was upwards of 35-40%, and today we're even after the cost of living crisis, we're around 5 to 7%. Now, obviously, it had been moving up, but in the grand scheme of things, the industrialization of food has brought these benefits. But I think we're now paying for them, and the concentration of supply, especially in more niche products. So, bees, for example, in California, you now have sort of professional beekeepers that have to move around in between almond plantations to pollinate the trees there. And the risk of disease getting in and either, wiping out or really detrimenting an auxiliary species, where you've got these kind of symbiotic relationships, or directly hitting crops themselves, is just growing and growing. We've seen that with cocoa. We've seen that with olive oil, orange juice in the last couple of years. And during that time, you get huge hyperinflation. And it is not hard to imagine a scenario where that starts to happen with larger and larger crops, and starts to have more and more of a marked impact on global inflation. And starts to move that kind of 5% of disposable income back up to levels that would be really detrimental, one, for the wider economy, but also for people who are already on the breadline.